In the early years of World War II, German officers sitting in strategy rooms all over occupied Europe couldn't help but laugh when they first saw pictures and early drawings of the cargo ships America was planning to build. The designs looked short, awkward, and kind of clumsy compared to the stylish warships Germany was so proud of. They sarcastically called them ugly ducks, sure that the ships were just floating coffins that would fall apart in rough seas. To the officers who had grown up admiring the precise engineering of German shipbuilding, the Liberty ships seemed like a silly attempt by an inexperienced country trying to act like it was at war. The officers' mockery wasn't just based on arrogance. Before the war, Germany had one of the best shipbuilding reputations in the world, and their navy was proud of its advanced technology and ruthless efficiency. On the other hand, the American Navy entered the war with a merchant fleet that was old, not good enough, and totally unprepared for the worldwide needs of total war. To German commanders, the idea that the United States could suddenly build a whole fleet of standard cargo ships in huge numbers seemed impossible. They pointed to the boxy hulls, the lack of elegant lines, and the clumsy look of the upper part of the ship as proof that these ships weren't fit for the ocean. But under the laughter was a sense of being too sure of themselves. German intelligence underestimated how big American industry could be, and how quickly its shipyards could adapt. They were used to thinking of shipbuilding as a slow, careful process that took months or years to build just one ship from start to finish. In their minds, warships had to be beautiful and well-made. Anything else was sure to fail. What they didn't realize was that America didn't plan to win the war with beauty or tradition. It planned to win with sheer numbers, efficiency, and constant production. At first, though, it seemed like the Germans were right. The first Liberty ships that were launched in late 1941 and early 1942 really didn't look impressive. Reports of cracks in the hulls and welding problems made it across the Atlantic, strengthening the belief that these ships were doomed to fail. German officers pointed to them as signs that America wasn't ready for war, repeating that a nation of consumers could never match the strong steel of Europe's war machine. Their propaganda even made fun of the ships, telling the German public that these clumsy ships would be easy targets for German submarines patrolling the Atlantic. But the Germans missed a key point. These ships were never meant to be admired for their elegance. They were designed to be made like cars, produced in huge numbers to make up for any losses caused by enemy submarines. They were the perfect example of industrial practicality. Maybe ugly but useful and, most importantly, replaceable. For every Liberty ship sunk by a torpedo or mine, 2 more would soon be coming out of American shipyards. The dismissive laughter of German officers in those early months showed a dangerous lack of awareness. By making fun of what they didn't understand, they ignored the quiet revolution happening in American industry. It was a revolution that would eventually turn the ugly ducks into the lifeline of Allied supplies. While German submarines roamed the seas, confident they could starve Britain and the Soviet Union into surrendering, American factories and shipyards quietly prepared to prove them wrong. The irony was strong. What the Germans mocked as crude would soon become one of the greatest logistical achievements of the war. The very ships they made fun of would turn the tide in the Atlantic and beyond, supplying Allied armies with a constant flow of materials. The ugly ducks were about to become the most important fleet of cargo ships the world had ever seen. The laughter of German officers echoed through the early years of the war. But behind closed doors in Washington and London, the mood was anything but amusement. By 1941, Britain was fighting for its survival, desperately relying on food, fuel, and weapons arriving across the Atlantic. Every day, German submarines sank Allied cargo ships faster than they could be replaced. Convoys lost ships in the icy waters of the North Atlantic, and there were nights when burning tankers lit up the waves for miles. It became clear that without a huge increase in cargo capacity, the Allies might lose not in battle, but in the silent war of logistics. For the United States, which was getting closer to directly joining the war, even before Pearl Harbor, the lesson was clear. The nation didn't just need warships, carriers, and bombers. It needed simple, strong freighters that could carry everything from canned meat to Sherman tanks. And it needed them in unbelievable numbers. The British had already tried building standard cargo ships, but their shipyards weren't big enough to produce enough. American planners realized they would have to do something that had never been done before. Design a ship so simple and standard that it could be built by almost any shipyard in the country. This wasn't about prestige or naval tradition. It was about survival. In conference rooms, naval officers and civilian leaders studied reports showing just how quickly the Atlantic supply line was being cut by German submarines. Some estimates warned that Britain's supplies might run out within months. No war plan, no matter how bold, could succeed if armies had no fuel, no food, and no ammunition. The problem was so urgent that it was more important than the pride of shipbuilders who didn't want to mass-produce ships. America needed a ship that could be built not in years, but in weeks, and by workers who might have never even seen the inside of a shipyard before. The design that came out wasn't beautiful. It was purposely plain, borrowing a lot from a British prototype, the Empire ship, but adapted to American industrial realities. Steel plates were cut to standard sizes, machinery was simplified, and every part of the design showed practicality over elegance. The goal wasn't to impress naval architects. It was to make a ship that could be copied again and again without needing specialized skills. Engineers removed unnecessary complexity and built something that could be welded together quickly on an assembly line. In many ways, it was the Model T of the seas, simple, tough, and built for the masses. As planners discussed the new ships, they also understood the psychological battle at stake. Germany's naval leaders believed they could defeat Britain by sinking more ships than the Allies could replace. If America could change that, if replacement ships could be launched faster than German submarines could destroy them, then the balance of the war at sea would change dramatically. The Liberty ship, as it would soon be called, became not just a ship, but a weapon of mass production, a direct challenge to the German belief that they were sure to win. Every part of the plan focused on scale. Materials would come from steel mills inland, transported by rail to shipyards on the coast. Entire workforces would be trained from scratch. Men and women who had never riveted or welded before would soon be building ships. It was a gamble on the sheer capacity of American industry and the willingness of ordinary people to meet extraordinary demands. The ship itself might be mocked as crude, but the idea behind it was radical. To flood the Atlantic with steel hulls until German torpedoes couldn't keep up. In those critical months before the assembly lines were even fully running, the Liberty ship represented hope. Hope that production could beat destruction, that quantity could beat quality, and that the Allies wouldn't be starved into surrendering. It was a bold gamble born out of desperation, but it would soon become one of the most important logistical achievements of the entire war. The solution to this desperate shipping crisis wouldn't have been possible without a man who was in many ways an outsider to traditional shipbuilding. Henry J. Kaiser, an industrialist who was previously known for building dams, highways, and huge construction projects, wasn't a trained naval architect. But when the U.S. Maritime Commission looked for ways to meet Britain's need for emergency cargo ships, Kaiser stepped up with a bold claim. He could deliver them faster and cheaper than anyone thought possible. Where experienced shipbuilders shook their heads and said it was impossible to mass-produce ships that could travel the ocean, Kaiser only saw an opportunity. Kaiser had already proven his skill in construction by finishing huge projects like the Hoover Dam ahead of schedule. He understood logistics, organization, and, most importantly, how to break down complex tasks into simple, repeatable steps. To him, a ship wasn't a handcrafted item that took years to build, but a giant machine that could be broken down into thousands of smaller parts and put together with industrial precision. If America's car factories could produce cars by the hundreds of thousands, then why not ships? It was an idea that shocked the conservative maritime industry, but it was exactly what the crisis needed. When Kaiser suggested using assembly line methods to build ships, many experts laughed. They argued that welding, the method Kaiser planned to use instead of traditional riveting, hadn't been tested on such a large scale. Riveting had been the main method of shipbuilding for decades, and welds were considered risky under the immense stress of ocean waves. But Kaiser's teams moved forward, convinced that welding was faster, cheaper, and required less skilled labor. Riveting required teams of trained men working closely together, while welding could be done by workers trained in weeks rather than years. For an America suddenly mobilizing millions into the armed forces, this difference was huge. Kaiser's vision went far beyond the technical aspects. He believed shipyards could be built in places no one expected, using new sources of labor. He looked for locations along the West Coast where vast new yards could be built almost overnight. Entire towns were built around these facilities, with housing, schools, and hospitals for workers. Men and women who had never touched a ship's hull before were recruited, trained, and put to work. By the thousands, women joined the workforce, taking up welding torches and riveting hammers, filling roles that had once been closed to them. The gamble was enormous. If Kaiser's methods failed, the Allied supply line could collapse, leaving Britain isolated and the Soviet Union undersupplied. But Kaiser was relentless, working around the clock, reorganizing shifts, and borrowing ideas from Detroit's automobile industry. He created a culture of speed and efficiency, offering rewards for crews that could beat construction deadlines. Competition between yards increased productivity, and soon records were broken as ships were launched at amazing speeds. In a way, Kaiser represented America's wartime transformation. He wasn't limited by tradition, but driven by innovation and urgency. While German officers laughed at the clumsy shapes of Liberty ships, Kaiser saw the bigger picture. Every hull launched meant more supplies across the Atlantic, more tanks arriving in North Africa, more food reaching British civilians, and more pressure on Hitler's war machine. To him, the ships didn't need to be elegant. They only needed to float, carry cargo, and be built fast enough to stay ahead of German torpedoes. What started as one man's bold claim quickly became a national effort. Kaiser's yards would soon set records that no German officer could have imagined possible, changing forever how the world thought about shipbuilding. The man mocked as a construction boss playing shipwright was about to prove that industry, not naval tradition, would decide the future of the seas. The change that made Kaiser's vision a reality depended on one key decision: abandoning the centuries-old method of riveting in favor of welding. Riveting, though reliable and strong, was slow and required a lot of labor, needing teams of skilled workers who worked in perfect harmony. It was a trade passed down through generations, with a sense of pride based on skill and tradition. Welding, on the other hand, was still considered experimental for large ships that traveled the ocean. Skeptics warned that welds could crack under the pressure of storms or the weight of cargo. To many old-school shipbuilders, trusting the future of the Allied supply line to this unproven shortcut seemed reckless. But time was the one thing America couldn't afford to waste. A riveted ship could take almost a year to finish. A welded one could theoretically be built in much less time. Welding required fewer workers, less specialized skill, and allowed for large, pre-made sections to be joined together quickly. Instead of building ships piece by piece inside a yard, entire hull sections could be made off-site, shipped in, and welded together like pieces of a giant puzzle. This modular approach was revolutionary, not only speeding up construction but also standardizing production so that shipyards across the country could follow the same designs. The introduction of welding also opened the door to a workforce that had never before been involved in shipbuilding. Women, many of whom had been excluded from industrial jobs, now picked up torches and learned to fuse steel plates together. Rosie the Riveter became a cultural icon, but in Liberty shipyards, it was often Rosie the Welder who made the difference. Housewives, teachers, farm workers, and clerks became industrial welders after just a few weeks of training. Their contribution became not just a necessity, but a symbol of America's total effort. Every citizen had a role to play in the fight against fascism. Of course, the change wasn't without its problems. Early Liberty ships suffered from brittle fractures, with steel hulls cracking in cold waters. German propaganda seized on these incidents, portraying the ships as poorly made and doomed to fail. But American engineers adapted quickly, improving steel quality and redesigning weak points. The sheer speed of production meant that even when ships were lost, replacements were already being prepared. The very flaws that critics pointed out only highlighted the difference in philosophy. Germany aimed for perfection, even if it meant taking more time, while America embraced practicality, willing to accept mistakes in order to flood the seas with replacements. The welding revolution also changed the pace of the shipyards themselves. Work continued around the clock under floodlights, with shifts operating day and night. Sparks from welding torches lit up the night skies over Portland, Richmond, and other shipbuilding centers. The sound of hammering rivets was replaced by the hiss of welding arcs, marking a new industrial age. Workers competed to see who could assemble faster, and entire hull sections were lifted into place by massive cranes, in scenes that looked more like car assembly lines than traditional shipyards. German officers who sneered at the Liberty ships as crude didn't understand this industrial revolution. Their idea of naval superiority was based on skill and elegance. But America was completely changing the rules. Welding wasn't just a technical change. It was a cultural and strategic shift that represented the very idea of wartime efficiency. The ugly ducks might not have been works of art, but they proved that quantity, when combined with innovation, could beat even the most refined engineering. In this way, Liberty ships became the first true assembly line fleet, and welding was the spark that started the transformation. It was a gamble that paid off. And soon, the cranes of Kaiser's yards and others across the nation were swinging huge steel sections into place, producing hulls at speeds the world had never seen before. As welding torches lit up American coastlines, the effort to turn designs into ships that could sail the sea spread far beyond traditional shipbuilding centers. One of the most amazing things about the Liberty ship program was how factories inland, rail networks, and entire communities were brought into the process. The United States didn't limit production to old maritime hubs. It mobilized the entire nation, from steel mills in Pennsylvania to sawmills in Oregon. Suddenly, small towns that had never seen an ocean became essential to launching ships that would sail across the Atlantic. The scale of organization was incredible. Raw steel, shaped and cut hundreds of miles from the coast, was transported by rail in huge, pre-made sections. Engines and boilers came out of factories that had been changed from making civilian products. A factory that made locomotives one month might be producing marine turbines the next. By dividing construction into smaller, manageable parts, the government made sure that industries across the country could contribute directly to shipbuilding. Every rail car of steel plates or precision machinery meant another Liberty ship getting closer to being launched. The shipyards themselves became small versions of wartime America. New cities popped up almost overnight around them, built to house tens of thousands of workers and their families. Entire neighborhoods were built from scratch, with rows of quickly built houses, schools with teachers recruited from all over the country, and medical clinics working overtime to handle the needs of the growing population. Cafeterias offered meals all day and night for workers on different schedules, and buses transported workers from their homes to the shipyard entrances at morning, midday, and night. It was a constantly moving world where the pace of life was determined not by the seasons changing, but by the next ship's launch date. The personal stories were just as amazing as the industrial accomplishments. Farmers left their farms, teachers left their classrooms, and office workers exchanged their books for welding tools. African Americans, who were often kept out of skilled factory jobs before the war, found new opportunities in the shipyards, even though they still faced discrimination. Women also joined the shipyards in huge numbers like never before. Their work clothes and goggles became a symbol of the changing American workforce. Families often worked together. Fathers worked as crane operators, mothers as welders, and teenage sons and daughters delivered parts or handled paperwork. For many workers, the shipyard was their first time working in a modern factory. Training centers taught basic welding, metalwork, safety rules, and fast courses that only lasted a few weeks. Mistakes were bound to happen, but the main idea was clear. It was better to build quickly and fix problems later than to waste valuable time. The urgency of the war made every worker feel like they had a mission. They understood that the steel ship bodies taking shape in dry docks were more than just machines. They were crucial supply lines to soldiers overseas and to allies fighting for their survival. When the first Liberty ships were launched from these new shipyards, it was more than just a factory milestone. It was a clear sign that America's vast inland areas had been connected to the oceans, that towns once far away from world events were now directly linked to the battlefields in Europe and the Pacific. The sheer boldness of building so many ocean-going ships in such unlikely places showed a turning point in the war of production. German officers who were confident that America's shipyards could never keep up had no idea about this massive effort. They saw plain square ship bodies and made fun of them. They didn't see the millions of workers, the trains rushing day and night with supplies, the families who had moved and changed their lives for a national mission. But it was exactly this hidden network of effort, stretching from inland factories to coastal cranes, that turned the Liberty ship from a simple drawing into the strong steel backbone of Allied supply. By the middle of the war, the incredible speed of Liberty ship production had become something to see. Newspapers printed headlines bragging about record-breaking launches, and pictures of huge ship bodies sliding into the water captured the public's attention. In just a few days, what used to take months or years was now normal. At the height of production, America was launching a Liberty ship every 3 days, an achievement that went against the traditional understanding of shipbuilding. For German officers who had once made fun of the awkward ship shapes, the numbers told a different story. No amount of U-boat attacks could keep up with such constant production. The change was most obvious in places like Richmond, California, where Henry J. Kaiser's shipyard set world records. One of his crews famously finished the SS Robert E. Perry in less than 5 days, from when the keel was laid to when it was launched. This was more of a demonstration of ability than a practical schedule, but it still shocked the world. Even though most ships took longer, the average building time dropped from months to weeks. The image of workers crowding around a half-finished ship, welding and lifting huge pre-made sections with cranes, became a symbol of America's industrial strength. The speed of launches boosted morale on both sides of the ocean. In Britain, where shortages had once led to gloomy predictions of collapse, each new group of Liberty ships arriving in port was welcomed as a crucial lifeline. Civilians who had survived the Blitz and years of rationing now saw real proof that America's promise of being a democratic arsenal was not just empty words. For soldiers fighting in North Africa, Italy, and later in France, the constant arrival of supplies, food, ammunition, tanks, and aircraft parts depended on the steady stream of these steel cargo ships. Every Liberty ship represented a floating guarantee that the Allies could keep up their attacks for a long time. The shipyards celebrated their accomplishments with pride. Launch ceremonies attracted crowds with bands playing patriotic songs as huge ship bodies slid into the water. Families of workers gathered to watch ships get named with bottles of champagne, often broken against the front of the ships by women who had worked in the yards themselves. These moments of victory fueled the spirit of a home front that was sacrificing long hours, limited goods, and constant hard work. The launches were not just factory events. They were national celebrations that reinforced the idea that ordinary Americans using welding tools and cranes were just as important to victory as soldiers on the front lines. Behind the celebration, the statistics showed the deeper strategic shift. By 1943, American shipyards had produced hundreds of Liberty ships, and by the end of the war, nearly 2,700 would be finished. German submarines, once the terror of the Atlantic, now faced a harsh reality. For every cargo ship they sank, new ones were launched faster than the U-boat could reload its torpedoes. The famous wolf packs that had once roamed the shipping lanes freely now faced groups of ships protected by escorts and constantly replaced with new ships. What Germany had planned as a slow strangulation of Britain became instead a battle they could not win. The sight of mass launches also dealt a psychological blow to the Axis powers. German officers who had dismissed the ships as fragile and ugly now received intelligence reports of shipyards producing ships at speeds that were unimaginable in Europe. The very factory efficiency they had made fun of had become a weapon more devastating than any single battleship or cruiser. It was not a navy of elegance and prestige that would control the seas, but a navy of endurance and numbers delivered every 3 days in steel and hard work. In this way, the Liberty ship program was more than just logistics. It was a demonstration of America's way of war production. While Germany and Japan aimed for precision and refinement, America embraced scale, speed, and the willingness to sacrifice elegance for quantity. The results spoke for themselves, and by 1944, the Liberty ship had become an unstoppable force that even the most determined submarine campaign could not stop. As the production increased, the Liberty ships were no longer just numbers in shipyard reports. They became the physical backbone of Allied campaigns all over the world. Their huge cargo holds, designed to carry anything from grain to heavy machinery, were quickly adapted to the changing needs of a world at war. Tanks rumbled up ramps into their holds, fighter planes were taken apart and packed inside, and mountains of ammunition were stacked from floor to ceiling. The sheer amount they could transport meant that entire offensives depended on their ability to deliver supplies across dangerous seas. In North Africa, the arrival of Liberty ship groups changed the Allied position. Rommel's Africa Corps had once pushed British forces to the edge, supported by fast German supply lines through the Mediterranean. But as Liberty ships unloaded crates of food, endless drums of fuel, and fleets of American-made trucks, the balance shifted. General Montgomery's armored units suddenly had the means to push forward, and American troops arriving with new equipment joined the fight with confidence. Every victory in the desert, from El Alamein to the final Tunisian campaign, showed the impact of Liberty ships that had made the journey across U-boat-infested waters. The role of these ships only grew as the war spread into Italy and France. When Allied armies prepared for Operation Overlord, the largest seaborne invasion in history, Liberty ships were essential. In the weeks before D-Day, they carried across the English Channel not only the soldiers who would storm Normandy, but also the mountains of material those soldiers needed: jeeps, bulldozers, artillery, medical supplies, even pre-made sections of harbors known as mulberries. The invasion force that broke through Hitler's fortress Europe could not have existed without the unbroken chain of Liberty ships delivering cargo day and night. Beyond Europe, their contribution reached into the Pacific, where distances were even greater and logistical challenges were huge. Liberty ships carried supplies to Australia, India, and countless remote islands where airstrips and naval bases had to be built from scratch. In jungles and on coral islands, American and Allied soldiers survived because Liberty ships kept arriving with food, medical equipment, and reinforcements. They were not fancy ships, but for men fighting in heat and mud thousands of miles from home, the sight of one appearing on the horizon was reassurance that they had not been forgotten. The Germans had hoped that their U-boats would starve Britain into surrender, but instead groups of Liberty ships became lifelines that could not be cut. The amount of cargo they delivered was staggering. Millions of tons of cargo that included wheat from American farms, munitions from Midwestern factories, and oil from Texas fields. German officers who once joked about the ugly ships found themselves facing the reality that these ships were directly fueling the Allied advance. Every shell fired from a howitzer in Italy, every ration box opened by a soldier in Normandy, every gallon of gasoline poured into a Sherman tank in France, all had likely crossed the ocean inside a Liberty ship. The impact of their cargo went beyond military supplies. Liberty ships also carried Red Cross packages, letters from home, and essential goods that boosted civilian morale in Britain and other Allied nations. For populations that had endured years of rationing, these deliveries symbolized endurance and hope. A Liberty ship docking in Liverpool or Glasgow might unload not only ammunition, but also flour, sugar, and canned goods that helped keep entire cities alive. By the war's later years, Liberty ships had proven themselves more than just temporary fixes. They were symbols of endurance, mobility, and resolve. Their bulk might not have inspired admiration, but their usefulness won grudging respect even from critics. German officers reading intelligence reports of Allied operations could no longer dismiss them as simple failures. The ugly ships had become the ships laying golden eggs, supporting armies, feeding nations, and ensuring that the momentum of the war turned decisively against the Axis. By the closing years of the war, the mockery that had once filled German strategy rooms had gone silent. The same officers who had made fun of the awkward shapes of the Liberty ships were now faced with a harsh reality they could not ignore. Their wolf packs, once successful in the Atlantic, had been overwhelmed by groups of ships that seemed endless. For every ship lost, new ones replaced it within days. The very ships dismissed as ugly ships had become the backbone of Allied logistics, and their presence on every ocean showed a reality the Axis had failed to foresee. America's strength was not in elegance, but in scale. The irony was clear. Germany had invested huge resources into engineering wonders, sleek U-boats, advanced warships, and tanks that showed technological prestige. Yet those machines, however impressive, could not undo the quiet power of thousands of cargo ships churning across the seas, carrying the weight of Allied industry on their steel decks. Liberty ships did not need to be invincible. They only needed to be numerous, and in their sheer numbers, they achieved what no fleet of battleships could. They guaranteed that the Allies could fight a long war without fear of starvation or supply collapse. For the men who sailed them, Liberty ships became both lifelines and symbols of endurance. Crews braved the threat of torpedoes, storms, and long periods of boredom at sea, knowing that the cargo in their holds was more valuable than gold. Each voyage carried the hopes of soldiers on distant battlefields, and civilians enduring the hardships of war. Their stories were rarely glamorous, overshadowed by tales of combat. But without them, victories in North Africa, Normandy, and the Pacific would have been impossible. Even after the war ended in 1945, the legacy of these ships continued. Many Liberty ships continued to serve, converted to peacetime trade, carrying goods that rebuilt a shattered world. Others were sold to foreign nations, spreading their usefulness across global commerce. Some rusted away in reserve fleets, reminders of a time when speed and necessity had reshaped the very nature of shipbuilding. A few preserved as museum ships still float today, silent witnesses to the extraordinary industrial effort that once defied both time and enemy. Historians later argued that the Liberty ships embodied the essence of America's wartime strategy, overwhelming the enemy not with brilliance in a single battle, but with constant production that no opponent could match. They were plain, awkward, and sometimes fragile, yet they carried on their steel frames the very foundation of Allied victory. In their shadows, German officers had been forced to admit that their laughter was misplaced. The ships they once ridiculed had helped sink their ambitions. The ugly ships had grown into a different kind of swan, not graceful, but essential. They proved that wars in the modern age would not be won solely by the sharpness of a blade or the brilliance of a single machine, but by the unyielding power of industry and the will to mobilize a nation's full potential. In the end, the Liberty ships were not just ships. They were a statement that mockery could not stop steel, that derision could not sink determination, and that the tides of war belonged not to those who laughed, but to those who built.